Our next standard is solve and graph absolute value equations and inequalities. There are four main objectives in this standard. They are to solve an absolute value equation, solve an absolute value inequality, graph an absolute value equation, and graph an absolute value inequality. In order to earn a level 1, you need to just be able to do one of those things. A level 2 requires you to be able to do two of those things. A level 3 requires you to be able to do three of those things. And finally, a level 4 requires you to be able to do all four of those things with no errors. Let's first break down what an absolute value is. It may be in your best interest to go ahead and pause the video right here, copy this down because I'm going to continue to talk about this. Absolute value is most simply put the distance a number is from 0 on a number line. If we take 5, for example, 5 is exactly 5 places away from 0. Negative 5 is also 5 places away from 0. Because absolute value is the distance, absolute value can never be a negative number. It is always positive. When we want a number to find the absolute value, we put these brackets on either side of the number. That indicates that we want to know how far away from 0 is whatever is inside these brackets. So if I put negative 5 in the middle, then the answer to this would be it's 5. If I put x plus 3 in the middle, then that means whatever is inside that, I want to know how far away from 0 it is. So here's an example of absolute value brackets in action. The absolute value of 6 is 6. The absolute value of negative 6 is 6. They both have the same exact absolute value because they are both 6 places away from 0. In this non-example, the absolute value of negative 6 cannot be negative 6 because absolute value is never considered negative. Now, in absolute value equations, we may end up having what we call the empty set as our solution. That is because we may get some solutions, but when they're plugged back in, the absolute value does not make them true solutions. And so when that happens and we don't have any of them that actually work when they're plugged in, then we consider that the empty set and we would write the answer as no solution. Because of this, we need to make sure that we always take our answers and we plug them back into the original equation and see that they work. Let's do some examples. So when solving an absolute value equation, we need to always get the absolute value alone first. So we need to make one little fix in our notes here. You may or may not have the version of notes that has this error, but this should say equation. And like I said, the first step is to always get your absolute values alone first. That means that we never ever distribute inside of an absolute value. They are not parentheses. Once you have gotten those absolute values alone, then we can work through and start solving them. So number 1 here, we have an absolute value that's already all by itself, and we want to know when is the absolute value of y plus 3 equal to 8. Well, there are actually two values here that have an absolute value of 8. Remember my example of 5 and negative 5. If I have 8 on a number line, it is 8 spaces away from 0, meaning the absolute value of 8 is 8. If I put negative 8 on the number line, it is also 8 spaces away from 0. The absolute value of negative 8 is also equal to 8. Therefore, what's inside of this here, just the y plus 3 part, it could be equal to positive 8. Y plus 3 equals 8, because when I take the absolute value, I'll get 8. But y plus 3 could also be negative 8. So we have to split our absolute values into two separate equations once we have that absolute value all by itself, and then solve out each equation to find our potential solutions. So we're going to subtract 3 from both sides, and we get y is equal to 5. Subtract 3 from both sides here, and y was equal to negative 11. Now we must actually take these and plug them back into the original equation to make sure that they work. If I take and put 5 in for y, I get that 5 plus 3 is 8, and we know that the absolute value of 8 is 8 because it is 8 spaces away from 0. Let's check and make sure that negative 11 works. The absolute value of negative 11, plugging that in for y, plus 3. Negative 11 plus 3 is negative 8, and the absolute value of negative 8 is 8. That means that both of these solutions are true, and I need to include both of those as my answer. In the next problem, to get the absolute value by itself, we need to subtract 5 from both sides, which leaves us the absolute value of 6 minus 4t equals negative 5. Now, if you remember the definition of absolute value, we can see that there's going to be an issue here. The definition of absolute value said it was the distance a number is from 0. We said that it's never negative. So I have an absolute value equals a negative number. That should be sending off red flags. Just in case maybe you're working through on an assessment or even on homework and you don't recognize that, hey, that might be an issue, let's see what would happen. Most people, when they make a mistake with this kind of problem, they go ahead and they split it up into 6 minus 4t equals positive 5 and 6 minus 4t equals negative 5. And they continue solving their problem. Subtract 6 from both sides so that negative 4t equals negative 1. Then they divide by negative 4 on both sides, and they get that t equals 1/4. Sorry, that got kind of small. Then let's do the other one. Subtract 6 from both sides. Negative 4t is equal to negative 11. Divide by negative 4 on both sides, and I get that t is equal to 11/4. Well, let's take that 1/4 and plug it back into the original problem. Absolute value of 6 minus 4 times 1/4, close your absolute value, plus 5. Let's check it. 4 times 1/4 gives me just 1. 6 minus 1 is negative 5. The absolute value of negative 5 is positive 5. And 5 plus 5 is 10. That's not the 0 that we wanted when we started off. So that means that this solution is not one that I'm allowed to include. Let's check 11/4, but let's use our calculator. So I need to put the absolute value of 6 minus 4 times 11/4 into my calculator. Well, to find absolute value, you're going to use that math button again, math. You're going to use the arrow key to go over to NUM. And then the very first one should be ABS. It should be our absolute value. Now, some of your calculators are going to look just a little bit different when you press that ABS. Math, NUM, ABS. They might look like this. Either way, it's the same thing. Just be sure that if your calculator does look like this, when you are finished entering in everything that's inside the absolute value symbols, you need to put another parenthesis to close it off before you continue. But I'm going to go back to our form that we were using before so that it looks closest to like what's on my page. So I'm going to press 6 minus 4 times, and I want to plug in 11 over 4 for t. So parentheses for fractions, 11 over 4, close my parentheses. Now I'm done with everything that's inside of my absolute value symbol. So for this version of calculator, you would just press the arrow to get out of the absolute value. If you had that other version that said ABS and opened parentheses, there's where you would end your parentheses. And then press plus 5. And we can see that that equals 10. That's not the 0 that we wanted. So that means that this solution doesn't work either. Well, that's all the solutions that I came up with, which means this is an example of something that would be no solution. The answer is just an empty set. Let's do a couple more examples. Let's take a look at number 3. So this time we have the absolute value, which is already by itself. That's good. But it equals an expression instead of a number. So when I go to set up the two separate equations, I'm going to have one of them as 8 plus y equals 2y minus 3. Easy enough. But then the other side, or the other equation, will be 8 plus y, and it will equal negative with parentheses 2y minus 3. Because we want the opposite of the entire expression, we need to put parentheses around it so that we'll have to distribute the negative. So let's go and solve this. I'm going to subtract 2y from both sides, giving us 8 minus y equals negative 3. Now we'll subtract 8 from both sides, and we have negative y equals negative 11. Divide by negative 1 so that we get y equals positive 11. On the other one, we need to distribute the negative first. So we have 8 plus y equals negative 2y, positive 3. So we will now add 2y to both sides. 8 plus 3y equals 3. Subtract 8 from both sides, and 3y will equal negative 5. Divide by 3 on both sides, and we get a possible solution at negative 5, 3. So we are going to actually take and plug these back in to see if they work. You can plug them in by hand or on the calculator, but if you plugged them in by hand, you'd be taking 11 and putting it in for both of the y's, and then plug in negative 5/3 for both of the y's, and you want to make sure you get the same on each side. So here's what it looks like if you were to do it by hand with 11. I plugged in 11 for this y and 11 for this y. And I'm going to go ahead and give us a little bit more practice going to that absolute value function on our calculator. So I'll use our calculator even though I know that you can do this part without it. We want to go to Math, NUM, absolute value of 8 plus 11. And we get that 19 is on the left. Okay, we should be getting 19 on the other side too if it's true. So 2 times 11 minus 3. and we get 19. That means that 11 really is a solution to this. Let's check negative 5/3. So I'm going to take and put in negative 5/3 as my y. So in my calculator, I'm going to use the math button, math, arrow over to NUM, and select the first one. 8 plus parentheses negative 5/3. You could also do this as 8 minus parentheses 5/3. And then press enter. And we get math frac 19/3. Let's check the other side. 2 times parentheses negative 5/3 minus 3. And we can see that I did not quite get the same thing on both sides. One was positive and one was negative. This did not make a true statement, so then this is not a solution. Now, unlike in our previous example, we couldn't tell that it wasn't a solution or that I would have something that wasn't a solution until the very end when I plugged it in. That's why it's so important that you always take your answers and plug them in, because if you were to include both of these, you would not be able to get credit for saying that you can solve a one variable absolute value equation. Let's take a look at the next problem. My first step is to get the absolute value alone. So we'll add 5 to both sides. 5 times the absolute value of 2r plus 3 equals 5. Then we cannot distribute this 5 in here. We have to divide by 5 on both sides. And that gives us the absolute value of 2r plus 3 equals 1. So we'll split this into 2. 2r plus 3 equals 1, and 2r plus 3 equals negative 1. Notice that when I split those into 2, we no longer care about those brackets from the absolute value. We only care about what's inside of them. So we're going to subtract 3 from both sides. 2r equals negative 2. Divide by 2 on both sides. And r is equal to negative 1. Look at the next one. Subtract 3 from both sides. 2r is equal to negative 4. Divide by 2 on both sides, and r is equal to negative 2. Let's check both of them, make sure that they work. So in my calculator, 5 math, NUM, option 1, and then 2 times negative 1 plus 3. Get out of the absolute value, subtract 5. And we get 0. That's what I needed on the other side. That means this is a solution. Let's check negative 2. Now there's actually a really neat thing you can do on your calculator. Instead of having to type all of that in again, you can, depending on the version of your calculator, I believe TI-84s and later, you can use the arrow key to go up and highlight. You can see it's very light, but it is highlighted in blue. And press enter and it'll copy and paste that below. If you have an older calculator like a TI-83, you can still get what you previously put in. You just have to press second, which is that blue button, and then enter, and it will go up. The more you press second, enter, the further up into the memory it'll go. So we're going to change that negative 1 to 2. Of course, you don't have to use that copy and paste feature. You can always retype it in, just trying to save you a little bit of time. And when I do that, I get 0 again. That means that both of these are solutions. Let's do 2 more. Get the absolute value alone, so we'll add 6 to both sides. negative 2 absolute value of 7 minus 3y equals negative 8. Then we're going to divide by negative 2 because we cannot distribute. And we get the absolute value of 7 minus 3y is equal to positive 4. So don't make any decisions about whether something's going to be no solution until you have your absolute value all by itself, because something that started with a negative all of a sudden is no longer negative. So we'll split it into two parts now. 7 minus 3y equals 4. And 7 minus 3y equals negative 4. Subtract 7 from both sides, and we get negative 3y is equal to negative 3. Divide by negative 3 on both sides, and a possible solution is positive 1. Subtract 7 from both sides. Negative 3y equals negative 11. Divide by negative 3 on both sides, and y is equal to possible solution of 11/3. Let's check those in our calculator. Back to the original problem up here. So negative 2 times math NUM absolute value, 7 minus 3 times, we're going to plug in 1 for y. And then minus 6. We get negative 14, so we know this one works. We can type it all in again or go up and use your copy and paste feature. But please look, because now we're inputting something that's bigger than just 1. It takes up more spaces. So we have to actually use second, and it's the insert button. Second, and this insert button will allow me to type more things into this calculator. So insert, I have 11 over 3. And if you're unsure about any of these things that we're telling you on the calculator, it's okay. You can type in the whole thing again. It will not cost you as much time as you think. So I plugged in 11/3 in for y, and I get negative 14, which is what I was looking for. So there's my solution. 11/3 and 1. One more problem. We need to get the absolute value by itself. So to get rid of this 4, we're going to multiply by 4 on both sides, giving us absolute value of 5p plus 10. And then it equals 8. So let's separate this into two parts. 5p plus 10 equals 8. 5p plus 10 equals negative 8. Subtract 10 from both sides. 5p equals negative 2. Divide by 5 on both sides, and we get that p is equal to negative 2/5. Subtract 10 from both sides. 5p equals negative 18. Divide by 5 on both sides, and we get that p could be negative 18/5. Let's go ahead and plug those in to the original equation and see if they work. So I have the absolute value, so math NUM absolute value of 5 times, we're going to do negative 2/5 first, plus 10. And we want to divide that by 4. And we get 2. Perfect. Let's do it again. This time we'll plug in negative 18. So negative 18 divided by, oh, see, I've ran out of room because this took up more digits. So second insert divided by 5. So there's our negative 18/5. And we get 2 as our answer. So that means I know that I've done this problem correctly. And I know that both of these are solutions.